know that some in our audience know the finer points of hockey.
The Chris Johnston Show.
We are your friends.
The biggest stories, bringing you inside the game.
What did you hear?
The Chris Johnston Show.
What is going on?
Here's Chris with your host, Julian McKenzie.
Part of the game.
CJ, we have ourselves a jam-packed Monday edition of the Chris Johnston Show. We're going to get to the Oilers. We're going to get to the Leafs. We're going to get to questions for Ask CJ. But we have to start off with the biggest story revolving around the hockey world. Two incidents involving racism took place over the last few days in the AHL. Christoph Hrabik of the San Jose Barracuda suspended for a racial gesture towards Boko Imama, who plays for the Tucson Roadrunners of the AHL. This is not the first time he's been subjected to something like this. Brandon Manning, I believe during the 2019-2020 season, delivered a racial gesture towards Boko Imama. And then not long after that, just during the weekend, video circulates of an incident between Jacob Panetta and Jordan Subban. And a monkey-like gesture from Jacob Panetta towards Jordan Subban in the video that we saw, which PK Subban, Jordan's brother, later retweeted and talked about on his social media platforms. That goes viral, and Panetta eventually thrown out of the game for the racial gesture. The officials do actually say for a racist gesture.
Number 15, Jacob Panetta, 5 minutes for fighting. A game misconduct for continuation, a game misconduct for a racial gesture, and a 2-minute unsportsmanlike conduct. And
eventually leads to a suspension, suspended indefinitely, and Panetta is eventually released from his ECHL team. Different players around the hockey world, Tom Wilson, Jason Zucker, have tweeted in support of Jordan Subban. PK Subban spoke about it to the media.
I'd rather just people focus on how can we change it and make it better so that the next kid that looks like PK Subban or Jordan Subban doesn't have to go through this.
Jacob Panetta delivered a statement over Twitter. We're going to try to cover all that as much as we can. But CJ, just to get us started here, what were your initial reactions to what happened?
Well, I mean, it's disgusting, obviously. I mean, we're not, I don't think there's any debate about, it's more just like, how are these things happening? The Panetta Subban one is interesting, right? Because on one hand, I watched Jacob Panetta's video, 2.5 minutes, where he apologizes. He lays out a plausible case, where he says that he was making a bodybuilder-like gesture after, saying something to Jordan Subban along the lines of, you only get tough when the referees are there to protect you, essentially. It's plausible, but I think you hit on the key point here. The referee in the game, highlights the fact that it was a racial gesture. He felt it was, and Jordan Subban, who was on the receiving end, felt it was. And so, that alone makes it troubling, of course. And, I can't help but sort of zoom out just a little bit more and think we're 2 weeks after the Hockey Diversity Alliance has teamed up with Budweiser and launched that campaign. We see Willie O'Rees, number 22, go to the rafters at TD Garden in Boston last week, the first Black player in the NHL. And, it's hard not to look at it all and just think this is still a sign of how much distance and ground the sport has to cover. I think the NHL as a body has to do more, even though the two incidents we're highlighting here happened in lower leagues in the AHL and the ECHL. There's still a gap there between the HDA and the NHL. And so, I'm sorry that anyone had to be involved in this, but you hope that if you want to take a hopeful takeaway from it, Julian, is just a reminder, it's not like this is a past tense problem. And I'd like to see, harsher consequences, honestly. I mean, we saw that a little bit. The Brandon Manning incident you mentioned from January 2020 was a racial slur. He got a 5-game suspension. It's a 30-game suspension for the gesture that Hrabik made to Boko Imama. So, you are seeing, I think, a change there in the approach, but I think there has to be more deterrence put in place too. But also give your head a shake. Like, I don't understand how this is still a thing myself. I realize that's a bit of a naive point of view, but that's kind of where my brain goes. Like, how is this even something that's happening? But, you know, you see it in soccer. I know it's a huge issue in European soccer, you know, a lot of different tensions there. And so, you know, it's not like hockey's alone here, but hockey certainly has to step up. And, you know, it's nice to see some of those other players too come out and speak out, because I think that helps the cause as well.
Two things. So yes, these incidents happen after the number 22 being retired for Willie O'Ree. Not to mention Martin Luther King Day was on Monday, a man who sought through the civil rights movement to unite people regardless of race. You see people sharing the MLK quotes all the time about how, you know, he had a dream and all that, right? Like we've seen all that. Just to me, as a Black person who follows the game and is a fan of the game, it does feel like a slap in the face, right? Like it feels very insulting and very tone deaf that we get not one, but two racist incidents happening after days that are supposed to be, you know, signifiers of social progress within hockey and just in life in general. I also want to discuss the Pineda statement as well, because I have a lot of questions about that statement. So PK Subban, I believe, when he tweeted the video, said that Jacob deleted his social media pretty much in light of what had happened on the ice with him and Jordan. And then on Sunday,
he did. Like Jordan tagged him in the original post, like he tagged his Twitter handle. And by the time I had clicked on it, the account was already deactivated Saturday night. Right.
But on Sunday, we see this video pop up and his social media comes back. I'm going to go through. So in our group chat that CJ and I have, we were just talking about it the day before we were going to talk about it here on the show. And CJ asked me for my thoughts about the video, and I gave him a list of questions. If you don't mind, CJ, I'm going to go through the list of questions that I have about the video.
Sure.
It was about 5 questions. So why did this video come after Jacob was suspended indefinitely? And I understand it is pending a hearing with the as per the league CBA. But why did this come after the suspension and after he was released? What was the ECHL's process in determining that Jacob was in fact worthy of being suspended? And what was Jacksonville's process for releasing him? Why did Jacob delete his social media and then just resurface back with this statement? I also want to know for sure from Jordan if Jacob did in fact try to make clear that the gesture that he did was not racist. And 5, is it true that Pineda has done this to other players? This tough man gesture. As a bonus point too, this is just my view on it. Tom Wilson stepped up in support of his friend Jordan Subban. When people, at least from what I've seen on social media, make the point that the gesture that Pineda made is a tough guy gesture, the exhibit A that we see is Tom Wilson in the penalty box in that game against New York Rangers. Tom Wilson should know more than anybody else about what the tough guy gesture should look like. And even him, whether it's just because Jordan Subban's his friend, he wants to support his friend, he knows more than anybody about that gesture, and he sided with Jordan Subban on this.
Well, I mean, I'm of the view we should all side with Jordan Subban eventually, because if he felt that's what happened, I mean, let's reverse engineer this. There's no way, there's no planet on Earth, there's no way he would ever suggest that something like that happened if he didn't believe it happened. Do you know what I mean? I don't even think Jordan Subban didn't need this, right? Jordan Subban played a hockey game on Saturday night. He didn't need to bring all this, attention or spotlight towards him, all this conversation, have his brother PK being asked about it after his NHL games or before his games. This is, obviously he feels that this is what this was. Now, maybe those two will have a talk. Maybe there's, and if I'm willing to, of course, adjust my opinion if Jordan Subban does. I mean, he was the one who the gesture was made at. He knows what was said on the ice. He knows what led up to that in the game. He's got a better sense of what happened here than anyone. I mean, I know there's video, kind of scratchy ECHL video, but basically when he says that that's what happened, I take him at his word, because I don't believe he would want, this isn't like a small accusation. So And the fact that the referee, I mean, that the audio is pretty telling that the referee, who was also on the ice, presumably again privy to what was being said and saw it from pretty close range, felt it was a racial gesture. I mean, it's good enough for me. It's hard to put your mind around this, honestly. Like, I mean, and I'm saying that as a white man, so I can understand. I'm sure for you seeing this and being part of the game, and it wouldn't be the first time, but it's hard to imagine that this is happening on the ice in pro hockey game. Like, it's crazy to me that it's 2022 and that's where it is. And, I think the conversation it's important though, right? You hope that, first of all, you hope that the sanctions are heavy, because I do think that's a deterrent. And I think bringing light to this and talking about it, even if it's a little uncomfortable or, it's hard to process, I think is important to making sure that it's just clear. Like, I almost it feels insane saying this. It's just, what are you doing? Why? I don't understand. I don't get it, how that's happened and continues to happen.
Yeah. It's something that upset me a lot, to be honest. I think I gave myself a lot of Sunday to think about what had happened and to feel a way about it. At first I thought I was just going to feel kind of borderline apathetic, but I realized how angry I was getting about it. And I thought of all my other Black friends were into hockey and other persons of color were affected by it. And there were people who were affected by it. And it's just, I say apathetic because it's something that keeps happening and happening and happening. And I can't help but bring up a timeline again and all the events that happened just before the incidents. And it's just kind of like, well, if people went through, if people saw the jersey retirement of Willie O'Ree, a guy who was the first Black player to play in hockey, the Jackie Robinson of this sport, and not realize what his efforts mean to the advancement of our game when it comes to integrating different races. When people, if those people saw the Hockey Diversity Alliance ad campaign and you don't feel anything by it, like at this point, like, what do you do? Also, Akil Thomas, I should bring this up. I believe is still in the Kings organization, tweeted about the video with the incident involving Jordan Subban and Jacob Panetta, and tried to bring attention to the crowd in that game as well. And I think some of the sounds from the crowd could be a little inconclusive, but a lot of them sound like they're egging on what's going on. It's a lot of people about this who don't look good as far as I'm concerned. And it's upsetting. Funny, I
used it, Akil Thomas tweet at the top of my Inside the NHL column. And what struck me is, here you have 22-year-old guy at the start of his pro hockey career, former Canadian World Junior hero, won a gold medal for Canada, and he tweets, "Is this the game I love?" Like, rhetorically, of course. I mean, that's sad, right? It's sad. He's I don't know Akil, and I've never asked him. I don't know what he was or wasn't exposed to, but as a young man of color with promising pro hockey career, I mean, he's tweeting, "Is this the game I love?" I mean, it just hit me for some reason when he put it that way, and he linked to the video that you're mentioning. I mean, it just seems that pretty. I can't speak for every last person of color in the NHL, but it feels like everyone has stories, based on, I know those involved in the HDA. I don't know if you read any of the coverage, Julian, when they launched that Budweiser campaign, because there's a number of stories, like a lot of, it's just interesting to hear the different perspectives of the players. Wayne Simmons talking about knowing people to this day that play minor hockey in Toronto that have had like issues this season, racial related incidents. I guess I really admire the fight that's there from those guys with the HTA, because I realize that it's not a clear path, and they haven't been. The NHL hasn't put their arms around them. I mean, I think if you want to appeal to even a different part, like, to me, this is important for the NHL as a business decision, frankly. And we don't even need to go there in general. But I mean, I think that when we talk about growing the game and putting the sport in the best possible position, I mean, that should make this alone a priority. It's also just the right thing to do, and usually you should do the right thing. I'm
glad you went there, because I wanted to talk about the people and entities who have come out in support of Jordan Subban and Boko Mama in light of what has happened. And I understand that because it is a developing thing. By the time that this podcast goes out, there may be more people added to this. But just from what I've seen, we've seen the Canadians tweet about it. In fact, I think they might have been the first NHL team to say something. And I know the reputation that's around the Canadians now in light of what's gone on over the summer. So for them to do that, that's very interesting to see. And also people have brought up the fact that the way they handled PK Subban, but still, I think it's very noteworthy that they were quick to this. The Devils obviously also tweeting about this as well. Tom Wilson, we mentioned, tweeting about this. Jason Zucker tweeting about this. AJ Greer, who I believe also plays for the Devils, tweeting about it as well. And again, there may be more names, but I wonder, for me, obviously the NBA, different composition, different league, different composition of players in it. But if something like this happened in the NBA, we would have heard from LeBron by now. In the NHL, why do we have to wonder when Sidney Crosby or Connor McDavid or some of the other bigger names and faces are going to say something? Like, I just think it's just natural if the NHL wants to act like it genuinely cares about this, and that's a whole other issue in itself about whether players in the league actually genuinely cares about this on its own. But you're right, from business decision, like, it would look good if one of those bigger stars tweets out in support of Jordan and Boko. Like, it just kind of works out that it should work out that way. But I think a lot of people will be disappointed at the fact that for something like this, some of the biggest players in the world at the very least seem silent. But also at the same time, I'm saying this from the vantage point of, we're recording on a Monday. It's entirely possible that by the end of today, more and more people could speak up about it. But at least on the onset, like, I didn't really see enough people step up and make it seem as if this is something that they genuinely care about.
Right. And it's funny, the way a former team executive once put it to me, he said, we want the best athletes to play our sport. Like, selfishly, if you love hockey and you want hockey to still be a great sport for many years, doesn't matter where the person's from. Obviously, doesn't matter their racial background, again, sexual preference. I mean, you just want the best athletes to want to hold a hockey stick and put on skates and play the game, because that's what will ensure that the game thrives and continues. And if you get to a point where you have huge segments of any population, again, that could be just all of a sudden if the country of Finland stops producing hockey players, like, that's bad for hockey in general. And clearly here, there's so many barriers for people of color to enter the game. We've just seen so few numbers. You want to knock those down because you want to have the best players. That's how this thing continues. Like, lots of businesses rise and fall. Sports will rise and fall over time. And so I think it again, in addition to being the right thing to do, and you almost feel silly having to go beyond that statement, I just feel like there needs to be more intention put there. And I think the NHL does recognize it. It just feels like they're lagging a little behind. But I was at the Board of Governors meeting in December, and there was a lengthy presentation there given to the league owners. Kim Davis, an executive at the league, I know was, and she's pushing hard, but it's going to take more than one person, even as driven and talented as she is, to drag the league forward. But I hope that's why I'm trying to find a hopeful sign in some of this, that some of the people you're talking about stepping up, some of those organizations that maybe even a year ago, if something similar had happened, we wouldn't expect them to, that there is at least small signs of progress here, Julian, but certainly not enough.
For sure. But I will also provide an optimist view and say that there are people who care about this stuff at a grassroots level, at the very least, or community organizations. I think of people or entities like the Black Girl Hockey Club, with the work being done by Renee Hess. I think of journalists and other media people who are unafraid of calling out the BS when they see it, like Shireen Ahmed. There are people who, and obviously in light of those incidents, there were a lot of people who were tweeting in support of Boko and Jordan. And I don't want to take the light away from them too, because it's not as if nobody cares. I think it's just there should be. They discussed
it on Hockey Night in Canada too, like in real time.
Absolutely,
they picked up the story pretty quickly, and
absolutely,
they they didn't just look past it that night. I mean, and sometimes in real time, live TV, you can miss stuff, but I thought they did a nice job with it.
They absolutely did. David Amber and Elliot Friedman were talking about both incidents on Hockey Night in Canada. And I think both of them did a great job. Yeah, this is something that a lot of people have noticed and a lot of people have taken the time to single out and talk about. And I'll say this, like, yeah, that's good. We're talking about on this podcast right now. I'm sure when you listen to the Steve Dangle podcast later, I know they have an announcement later coming, but they're probably going to dedicate some time to talking about this too, where we have the platforms that we have. And it's important that we talk about this sort of thing. Would this have been a thing 20, 30 years ago? Who knows? I don't know. But the fact that we're doing that work is encouraging. I guess it's just, I want to be at a point with racism where there's zero tolerance, and this is something we don't have to talk about like at all. And maybe the idea that it could be absolutely zero, in some people's eyes, could be an impossible thing, but I want that because I love the game of hockey, and I don't like the fact that things like racism stand in the way of it being great. So yeah, this is a story that I understand with the ECHL. At the very least, it's developing. If any other developments come, we'll obviously talk about it here on the CJ show. But it's just a very disappointing that these two incidents happened. I'm not happy about it. I know, CJ, you're not happy about it. It's very tough to do. And I also understand that because of the fact that we led the show with this, a bit of a tough segue to go talking about other hockey stories. But that's what happens.
Mama said enough is enough on his tweet. I like that.
He did. That's enough is enough. And I think that's how we should view it. Okay, hard transition. We'll go from the racist incidents that happened in the AHL, the ECHL. I want to go to the Edmonton Oilers first. They won a game over the weekend against the Calgary Flames. They snap a long, lengthy losing streak. Dave Tippett finally has a win for the first time in what feels like forever behind the bench. Leon Draisaitl goes off against the Flames. He gets that. I think he got 2 goals, including that second one. That was essentially a buzzer beater, just getting into the empty net with 0.1 second left on the clock. Praises Mikko Koskinen for his play after the game. CJ, have hard times finally come to an end in Edmonton?
Well, it's a start, right? I mean, I feel like we've discussed them on pretty much every pod. It feels like going back a month, and
they've given us content.
Yeah. Well, I mean, between the sparring with the reporters, Dave Tippett's job future, what Dave said about the goaltending, a few weeks ago, there's been a lot there. I think praise where it's due, right? Credit where it's due. We've kicked the goaltending pretty hard. Koskinen had a great game. No, that's sort of the ironic part is Edmonton probably didn't deserve to win the game, but they got a great goaltending performance, allowed them to do it. I don't know if you saw Daryl Sutter had kind of a dry quote. He's like, I don't know why you're all talking about their goaltending. That guy was great. It was pretty funny. And if you find Daryl Sutter funny, low-key funny, which I do, it was kind of a nod to everything that's been going on there. But yeah, they're still going to get a goaltender. I'm convinced of it. But getting a win probably eases some of the tension. I talked to a lot of people around that team in the last week or two, and basically everyone described the same situation, that it's as bad as they ever seen it in terms of just the atmosphere, obviously physically in the building. When you have a reporter incident like Jim Matheson, Leon Draisaitl, everyone is going to work a little bit on edge. But even just the feeling in the fan base, I'm sure local radio and the podcasts that are done around that, just apparently it was really tense. And so a win will help. I don't think we're done talking about the Oilers. I don't think that they're fully in the clear, of course. But, and I've tried to be fair with this in my analysis of them, there's a lot of games along that stretch where they were right in the game and with 5 minutes left and didn't get the 1 goal needed to win it. So it's not like they aren't losing every game 6-0 as they did to Florida in a game last week. So, I do think that they're going to be in the playoff chase this year. I just think absent some kind of miracle here, it's hard to imagine them truly being the sort of contender status that, I know we did that contender pretender show and I angered some people by saying that they weren't a contender, but I need to be proven otherwise. I don't see it. Maybe there's some goaltending acquisition. That's happened. I mean, Jordan Binnington came out of nowhere. I know it wasn't an acquisition by the Blues, but he started the year in the ECHL, and by the end of the year, he couldn't be beaten. They won a Stanley Cup. I mean, maybe there's some kind of great sporting story to be written here, but I think that there's still a lot of heat on the front office, in particular in that organization, to make some moves to get them out of this funk.
CJ, that Oilers win over the Flames was their 5th win since our episode of Contenders versus Pretenders. That's their 5th win since
How
that
many
episode.
losses, do you know?
Off top of my head, I think like 11.
Okay.
11 regulation losses and 2 OT losses. I wrote a whole tweet about how bad they were from that episode to basically the present day. The Canadians, at the time I wrote that tweet, had like 1 fewer win in that stretch of time than the Oilers did. Like, that's how bad things got in Edmonton. Like, I gotta say, you may have been right. Call it a pretender.
The blue line isn't deep enough. There's no third line essentially providing secondary scoring. And obviously, when you have Draisaitl and McDavid, you can get by for huge stretches of time with them doing most of the offensive work. And then the goaltending has not been strong. I don't know where they're at. They were bottom 5 team last I looked in terms of team save percentage. So it just wasn't the right mix to me. Even like you can have 2 guys wearing capes, man, flying around the ice, giving us highlight reel goals the way McDavid has this year, right at the top of the scoring list, the points list. But I mean, winning a game, winning a Stanley Cup, winning playoff rounds requires a lot more elements than that. And I just didn't see enough of the elements in their team. And I still don't. And I think it's too much work to expect it to be addressed at one deadline. You know, I think some of what we're talking about needs to be summer overhauling. Like it has to, if we could go back in time and not have them start the season with the 2 goaltenders being Mike Smith and Mikko Koskinen again, you know, the odds were better. They were going to have more success. Right. And they did actually make a lot of moves, spent a lot of money on free agents, you know, bringing in Cody Ceci, the trade for Duncan Keith, the extension to Tyson Barrie. But I just didn't see the right mix of players there. And so that's how I came to that conclusion. And you look at, story's not written. Maybe they rip off 10 straight wins and I look like an idiot. So like that's when we're observing sports in real time, that's the problem. Sometimes, you know, you go with what you see and what you feel and believe what you hear, but we can still be surprised.
Just to clarify here, the Oilers since that episode of Contenders versus Pretenders, 5-11-2, and that includes the win over the Flames on the weekend. And speaking of a winning streak, these are the next 4 games for the Oilers. The Vancouver Canucks, who we'll get to because they have some goaltending issues, the Nashville Predators, the Montreal Canadiens, and the Ottawa Senators. They could get some wins against those. Maybe, I'm not sure how it'll go against Nashville, but Canucks, Canadiens, Senators, 3 winnable games out of a possible 4 upcoming for the Edmonton Oilers. Like, even if it's not a winning streak, like that's just good for their morale.
They need a stretch like that. They need to sort of get 4 wins in a 5-game segment or something like that to feel better about themselves. Like Saturday definitely helps. There's no doubt. Just given how toxic or really, you know, that well was pretty poisoned by the time they were drinking on Saturday night. So, but to truly have some faith in what they're doing, and look, we haven't talked about it for a while, but I still believe there's a chance Evander Kane ends up there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe that'll be some kind of shot in the arm for the organization. I mean, and for Connor McDavid specifically, give them some better roster balance. I mean, you know, it's just hard to look at that team this deep. It's hard to sort of separate. I mean, we're evaluating this month, this season, but it's hard to think that it's like year 7 of Connor McDavid and they still have so many holes in their lineup, you know, in places where 97 and 29 aren't pinned on the board.
Does this sound familiar? You got one device that lets you catch the game live, another one that lets you stream your favorite shows, and you're watching sports highlights on your phone. I know I like to do that. And you've got your neighbor's best friend's login for the good stuff. I want to tell you about a simple way that gets you all the entertainment that you love without the hassle, and a great way to finally get your TV together. It's called Directv Stream, and it brings your live TV and on-demand favorites together like never before, so you can watch your favorite sports, movies, and shows all in one place. No more juggling remotes. You don't need to buy another device ever again. And the best part, there's no annual contract. Get rid of the clutter and the confusion and get your TV together with Directv Stream. You can learn more at directv.com. That's directv.com. Compatible device required. Content varies by package, but just go to directv.com. We're still in the middle of winter. Football and basketball and hockey very much in full swing. And for many of us, there's no better way to enjoy the games than by having some skin in the game. That is why BetMGM remains the exclusive betting partner of The Athletic. And as a fan of The Athletic, you can bet $10 to win $150 plus a free 3-month subscription or extension of your subscription to The Athletic when you bet with BetMGM using our promo code. Sign up at betmgm.com and use the promo code TheAthleticPod at checkout to take advantage of this special offer from the king of sportsbooks. That's bet $10 to win $150 plus 3 months free from The Athletic at betmgm.com. And you have to use the promo code TheAthleticPod at checkout. The Athletic Pod, all in one word. New customer offer. Visit betmgm.com for terms and conditions. Before I get to the Canucks, actually, I want to bring up the Leafs because that is your job to talk about the Toronto Maple Leafs, the work that you can see in the Toronto Star, but obviously, of course, you do work for North Star Bets. Of course, got to shout out North Star Bets. The Toronto Maple Leafs, they won over the weekend as well. They win 3-1 over the New York Islanders. It was 3-1, and they didn't blow a lead. They held on. And it actually comes after a loss we remember from earlier in the week against the New York Rangers where they blew a lead. And Sheldon Keefe called out his players, basically feeling they were soft and purposeless against the New York Rangers. What did you think of that comment from Sheldon Keefe? And do you think Chief Keefe got the desired effect from his comment in the way that the Leafs played on Saturday?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things here. Like Sheldon Keefe post game, he can be very direct and even just like a touch emotional. Like he can, it's not to say he doesn't mean what he says there, because I do believe he meant that. But the problem is, in any Canadian market where there's a lot of attention on the team, like everyone just clips out soft in particular and then extrapolates that to mean exactly as they want to say. They were soft when they blew a 3-1 lead to the Canadians in the playoffs. They were soft in Boston in 2018 or whatever. Whereas basically it gives everyone sort of license to run with how they want. I mean, and Sheldon Keefe, to his defense, did clarify when he spoke to the media a day or two later, sort of what he meant by that, sort of soften their approach. But I also view it as like it's gone pretty well in Toronto. Like I was just saying, we don't even talk about the Leafs on the podcast because there really hasn't been any calamity.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
You know what I mean? Like they've won, when he made that comment, they'd won 22 of 30 games going back to October. So he hasn't had many chances to use the stick against him, if you know what I mean. Like even in practice or what have you, there hasn't, when you're a coach, I think you almost get nervous sometimes that your players do get soft when things are coming easy, when it's rolling, that maybe bad habits are creeping in or this or that. And because they'd blown a series of leads going back to the game in Colorado, Vegas, St. Louis, some of those games they pulled out a win, but they blew leads in those games. And then to see it again after building a 3-0 lead against the Rangers last Wednesday, I think he saw it as an opportunity to, try to get everyone's attention. And he got tons of attention. I'm sure he loved the response. I mean, that was a pretty thorough win against the Islanders on Saturday. And, the Leafs are in an interesting spot, as I mentioned, just because, they're kind of cruising around the top of the league, 5th in points percentage in the NHL. They're in this murderer's row division. Like right now, they're 5th overall in the league and they're 3rd in the division. So because of the divisional playoff format, they would be opening right now if the playoffs started in Tampa on the road in round 1. And so I think that there's going to be a real push internally to try to win the division, just to have the best possible odds in your favor. If you face a game 7, to know it'll be on home ice, all those types of things. But, I think it'll be a louder second half around the Leafs, I guess, than the first, because other than the first 2 weeks of the season when they really stumbled and everyone was going crazy here, it's been pretty quiet around this team. Everything's sort of coming easy. I hate to say that. I'm sure they're working hard, but it looks like it's coming too easy for them at times. And I think that's probably why when things were sliding a bit, that Sheldon Keefe delivered that punch, I guess, sent his message.
It is interesting that we haven't talked. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think we've talked about the Leafs like kind of here and there, but there's just been so much with the Edmonton Oilers. We talked about the Canadiens and their GM search, and obviously other things have just kind of been sprinkled in here and there. And like after the Leafs, it kind of looked like they were on shaky ground to start, and then they kind of went on that run partway through the year. And even when they were going through those blown leads, I don't think we hammered on them enough. It is interesting that the Leafs are going through what they're going through. And I don't know. I find like I expected a situation where the Leafs would essentially maybe go on a run where things would just not go well and maybe a panic move would happen, but none of that has happened yet. And I think the Leafs are just saying like, no, this is the core we have in place. We're just going to stay by them and just in the hopes of running it back. Hopefully we finally achieve some success. But yeah,
I can explain why we haven't talked about him. It's because we all know deep down that the playoffs will be measuring how this season is viewed. I mean, this is the 5th season essentially where the Leafs have been a top 5 NHL team. Like if you look over the last 5 years in the regular season, they've been right near the top of the league, basically consistently. They did have one little swoon before Mike Babcock was fired a couple years ago, but even after Sheldon Keefe took over, they won like 15 to 20 games. And so we've seen this before. Austin Matthews, we've seen him score a boatload of goals, which he's done this season. William Nylander, John Tavares, all having great offensive seasons. They've had some nice stories, like Michael Bunting's produced really well on a cheap contract playing on their top line. Like there's really the Morgan Riley's having a great year. Honestly, since he signed his contract, he's been awesome. Jack Campbell's been one of the stories of the league. I know he's struggled a bit more recently, but becoming an all-star. So the point is everyone's heard all the good stories about the Leafs, and it's almost a little unfair. Like when you look at and I'm not saying this just conspires against the Leafs. It's unfair to Boston and Tampa and Florida too, that you basically have 4 of the top 10 teams in the league that all have to go through each other just by the way this format works. Like in the old days, if there was just the top 8 in the Eastern Conference, I think the path would be a little bit clearer, easier, however you want to look at it. But the Leafs will be judged by that first round series. And it's going to be against Tampa or Boston or Florida in all likelihood, unless they win the division and get a crossover or something. But more than likely, they're going to be playing one of those 3 teams, and they're all really good teams. And they're all teams that want to win a Stanley Cup and could win a Stanley Cup if things go their way. And I think that's why we're not talking about them. Honestly, I think it's just like, wake us up when we get to the trade deadline, see what you do there. We'll analyze that. And then wake us up when you get to the playoffs and see how you handle round 1.
By the way, just because CJ's saying what he's saying about the Leafs, Leafs fans who watch this podcast, please continue to watch this podcast because we will find ways to talk about the Leafs before the playoffs begin. Just because this regular season doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things does not mean we won't talk about the Toronto Maple Leafs. But also to everyone else who kind of looks at us and thinks like, stop talking so much about the Leafs. We'll find a way to talk about your team too. Like if you're the Vancouver Canucks and you find yourself
we've hammered the Canucks, we've hammered the Canadians, we hammered the Oilers.
Too.
I mean, like we've gone deep on all those teams. We've ignored Ottawa and Winnipeg, not on purpose, but we haven't given them as much love. But I mean, there's been enough fires around Canada that we've been tending to those.
Yeah, at the very least, yeah. And again, with the Canucks, they're down to their 5th goalie because of different circumstances. They started Michael DiPietro against the St. Louis Blues on Sunday night, and a U Sports goalie, Rylan Toth, was his backup. Thatcher Demko out because of COVID. A border issue with Yaroslav Halak made him unavailable. Spencer Martin was supposed to be the 3rd goalie. He was unavailable. Artur Silovs, who plays in Abbotsford, the AHL goalie, unavailable as well. And they were down to Michael DiPietro, a 5th stringer. I don't think I've seen anything like this. But then again, you know what? Because of the COVID, maybe I have. I don't know. That's actually a bit of a lie because the Canadians were basically at a point where they had like Michael McNeven as a backup. Like this is a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean that's a hard game to win against St. Louis. St. Louis obviously being a top team in the league too. Vancouver actually played pretty well. I think they did what they could in front of their 5th string goaltender, young player in DiPietro, still establishing himself as a pro. But yeah, like talk about being befallen by bad luck. Maybe we're like sensitive. Sorry, we've grown kind of just used to e-bugs because there has been a lot of e-bug like situations this year, particularly with COVID protocol. But I'm always fascinated when you got a U Sports goalie on the bench. We saw Alex Bishop with the Leafs early in the season, backed up a game with Jack Campbell. Where those guys are one shot or one injury, one collision away from coming into the game. Pretty interesting. My buddy Stephen Wino, shout out Stephen Wino, is working on a book on e-bugs. So I know he's been.
Oh, wow.
He's been, it was already in the works, the David Ayres story, the Scott Foster story, all that was already in the works before this season, but this season's put Steven into overdrive. And yeah, so no deep thoughts on the Canucks. I still think they're playing pretty well under Bruce Boudreau and they handle themselves well in that situation, but hopefully they get some health and guys out of protocol so that, they can start the 3rd stringer instead of the 5th stringer in the next game.
I'll give you two more quick topics before we get to Ask CJ. Jacob Chychrun, it seems as if the trade interest in him has shot up. Teams like the Los Angeles Kings, the Boston Bruins, the Florida Panthers, the Columbus Blue Jackets, the New York Rangers have expressed some interest in the Arizona Coyotes defenseman. What's your insight, your look on that? And tell us what you know.
Well, it's an interesting situation, right? Because this is a guy that's got 3 more years on his contract at $4.6 million, which is pretty reasonable, cap hit for the value he brings. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a deadline deal trade, right? I mean, it could happen soon. In theory, it could go into the summer. I mean, there's not really anything forcing Arizona to trade him other than the fact they're open to these conversations. There is interest, but I think there's a bit of a dance going on. And, I know it's been said elsewhere that, could be close. I don't get the sense it's close. Well, that problem with saying that is that could, change with one phone call today made to Bill Armstrong, the Coyotes GM. But, my sense around the situation is there's certainly interest, which has been reported on. But, I don't know that you're seeing that trade happen right now because, look, for the Coyotes to move him, it's got to be a significant package of assets to make that make sense. And the fact that you have all these teams sniffing around is notable. I think Boston's there. I can't remember mention that. And the Rangers.
Boston, yeah.
I've heard Columbus is kicking tires, which doesn't totally make sense to me just because they're kind of in their own little rebuild, but they're probably looking at him like he's 23. Like he could play for us for 10 years if we acquire him now. And guys like that aren't always made available on the trade market. So, it definitely bears watching. The Klingberg situation in Dallas to me has a little more urgency to it just because, I think that relationship is strained as we've mentioned. And, I do think the Stars would prefer to move him sooner than later if they could. But, I think defensemen are going to be the order of the day leading up to this trade deadline. I mean, there's a lot of players on expiring contracts, like a Klingberg, Mark Giordano. You have 2 defensemen in Anaheim, Josh Manson and Hampus Lindholm. We'll see if the Ducks are sellers or if they're holding on to those guys come March 21st. You have Ben Sherratt in Montreal, who I know a lot of contenders have kept an eye on as, an ad for, with the idea of having a playoff run. And so, I think that we'll see a lot of blue liners move between now and the deadline. And just seems to be the way it's flipped this year, that there's more maybe high quality players available at that position than the others.
And the final quick hit here, Hockey Canada announcing reports have swirled about some names being announced for Hockey Canada's men's hockey team at the Beijing Olympics. Eric Stahl, who we've talked about on the show before, Owen Power, Kent Johnson, Mark Barberio, David Dernay, among some of the names I believe the Athletic has confirmed. What's your insight on some of those names? I think the official roster should come out on Tuesday. Maybe I have that date wrong. I think I'm right.
No, Tuesday. They'll finalize the team. They've been at a training camp in Switzerland. I think it's going to, obviously I'd prefer the NHL be there just because I love the theater of all that. But I think it'll be interesting to watch that team go. I'm curious about Eric Stahl. He wants an NHL return. I think they'll make him the captain. And he was at the 2006 Turin games on the taxi squad at the time. He didn't get to play. He told me recently that, he just was there watching, Joe Thornton and Joe Sakic, I believe, was the captain of that team. He said he's 21-year-old kid at the time. And now he's going as sort of the graybeard. I like the bookends part of that story. Having Owen Power there, Owen won a world championship with Canada last spring. He's got a chance now to potentially win an Olympic gold medal, be 2/3 of the way to the triple gold club before he even plays his first NHL game. Would be pretty special, of course, if he's able to do that. And so, I like going with some of the younger guys. Team Canada didn't have as many options as the U.S. because NCAA players are eligible because they haven't signed NHL contracts, whereas a lot of the players that even are playing in Canadian junior leagues weren't eligible for Team Canada. So, they're trying to find the right mix between veterans and players that have played in the NHL, and then obviously young guys. And I'm curious to see the full list. Shane Doan being the GM of that team too, someone who represented Canada a ton as a player.
And Claude Julien as his head coach as well. Really intriguing to see what the names will be for that. And with that, It is time for Ask CJ, the segment we do on Monday episodes where we take questions from people like you, whether you follow both of us on Twitter, whether you read our stuff at our respective publications, whether you like to talk about things in the Discord, which, by the way, sdpn.ca is where you should go to be able to join the Discord. We're trying to get to about 10,000 people on the SDPN Discord. It is a bumping time. I've noticed a lot of the questions that have been sent in today coming from some celebrities, or at least some hockey-related celebrities, including one from Rachel Dory, who, speaking of the Vancouver Canucks, in the last few days just got a gig with them as a data analyst. Well, I say data analyst, but just analyst. But you get what I mean. Congratulations, Rachel, on the gig with the Vancouver Canucks. All the best to you with the Vancouver Canucks. And she actually sent in a question for the podcast. Okay. Any recommendations for food or activities for someone moving to Vancouver?
Well, that's going to be relevant to Rachel, I guess, when she finishes her schooling here. She'll be moving there to work full time. Well, I mean, I love the obvious activity there, which is, being on the seawall. My method of choice is usually a run when I'm in Vancouver. I've even run up around Stanley Park and all the way back downtown. It's like 15K or something. Like that, some of the best experiences are the ones you get for free, right? I mean, it's just beautiful. But I'd recommend if you coffee and a walk out there, or bike ride, if you rollerblade, what have you. It's just a nice way to experience the city, and it's just very peaceful. Honestly, beautiful spot. I'm trying to think of a good restaurant. There's one in the. Funny, this part of my brain, I haven't been traveling as much. I've spent a lot of time in Vancouver over the years, but there was a restaurant in the near the Douglas Hotel, which is not far from the arena, that I'd recommend you go, Rachel. But I'll send you a personal note on that when I think of it. Great city, and I do think congratulations, of course, to Rachel. The Staffing Graph podcast, I presume, is no more.
The Staffing Graph podcast, I think, will still be. They're just going to have a new co-host. I wonder who that's going to be. That's the podcast, obviously, that Rachel had with Mike Stevens. Yeah. But yeah, Rachel's not going to be part of the podcast anymore. Who knows what will happen with that? It's a shame too. They just joined the Hockey News as a podcast, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But again, congratulations.
That'd be hired by the Canucks. Honestly, Rachel's one of the great smart people in this space. I know she worked in New Jersey, got experience there. She's done a lot of things in the sport, and I think she'll be a valuable member of that front office.
Absolutely. Congrats again to Rachel. This one is from Ryan Rashad from TSN, a fellow colleague. What's the most angry you've ever made an athlete, and was it your fault? Joe Thornton is my answer. This is Ryan speaking. Joe Thornton is my answer, and yes, it really, really was.
I would think maybe Phil Kessel. It's not the famous clip where I'm in the middle and Phil's actually going at it with Dave Feschuk, who's now my colleague at the Toronto Star. I was just caught in the middle. That was friendly fire. There was nothing I said that particular day. There's a few times Phil and I had some exchanges. I mean, he was a challenging guy. I was stubborn too. Like he would just prefer the media never talk to him. Like that was his style, is he would be sort of difficult or whatever. And I think his hope was you just leave him alone because he wouldn't be that useful. And I was younger then and more kind of wasn't going to let it go down that way. And, we once had an exchange in a hallway. But I mean, no hard feelings, certainly. As I explained during the Jim Matson episode, like, I think it is part of the job. Sometimes there's a lot of pressure on the athletes, of course, and there can be pressure too on the journalist end of things, depending on what the day is and where you're at in your career, trying to get a story, trying to chase something down. It's funny that it's Joe Thornton for Ryan Rashad. I mean, Joe's one of the easiest guys to deal with in the league in a lot of ways. And I'm sure they smoothed it over afterwards, but Phil jumps to mind. And, as I mentioned too, Julian, like I find the confrontation level has gone down with the newer generation of players a little bit. And so the world's shifting and evolving. And so maybe we'll have a little bit less confrontation in the future.
I hope so too. From your former colleague at Sportsnet, Carly Agro, if the Buffalo Bills were an NHL team, which one would they be and why. This was sent before the Bills lost to Kansas City in the AFC divisional round on Sunday. Tough way to lose. They don't even get to touch the ball in overtime.
That was a hell of a game. I mean, their defense had to get a stop with 13 seconds left and a 3-point lead. I mean, that will haunt them. And I'm honestly not, like, I was spiritually rooting for the Bills. I mean, they're not my team, but I know enough people growing up here around Toronto that like them, and they have a great team. I was hoping they would get to the Super Bowl. But, I actually answered Carly's question in the paper, and so I got to stick with it. But I had trouble with this one. Like, it's a great question. It makes you think. And I ended up going with Carolina. And here's how I drew that parallel. Okay. I think that Carolina has sort of a sneaky, first of all, like Buffalo, the Bills, I think both of those teams are maybe overlooked by the national media a little bit. Like they kind of exist in their own little orbit, but they don't get the attention they might deserve. I think they both have like sneaky good fan bases. You can have a great hockey tailgate in Raleigh, just as you can have a great tailgate in Buffalo. And I think that there are two teams that are kind of right there, potentially waiting to break through as championship teams. And so that was why I went. That was sort of my logic with the parallels. I was thinking of Florida first, but Raleigh has more of the tailgate NFL style and kind of just this unique fan base. I think Buffalo's a unique fan base. Obviously, they jump through the tables and all that stuff in their tailgating. But I thought for me that was the best parallel. But it was a difficult question because I figured you have to have a team on the rise. It has to not be in like a big market or like an obvious market. And so I thought Carolina fit best, Carly.
This next one on Twitter comes from Kevin Pope. My question is about expansion teams. Adam Wilde said on a recent podcast that he thought London, England would get an NHL team before Quebec City. Do you think there will ever be a time where the league expands across the Atlantic?
I do. And I just can't tell you when, but it makes too much sense. Just because so many players are of Swedish heritage, Finnish heritage, Swiss, German, there's places in Europe that love hockey. I think what's held it back, quite honestly, is the European teams that play in leagues there. They can't charge anything like the ticket prices that the NHL charges. And so, and there's only so many stadiums that hold even 15,000 people, let alone 18 or 20,000, which you see in NHL cities. But I still think in time that is an evolution that will happen. But I'm certainly not thinking it's going to happen next year. I mean, one of these teams is going to take the plunge. Like the NFL, it feels like it's sitting right there for them with only playing one game a week. The travel situation is minimized, in my opinion. Obviously, they play multiple games there a year now. I actually lived in London, England for a year. There's a great sport culture in that city, and obviously people from all over the world live there. Like it was the coolest place I've ever. Like it feels like the whole world is in one place, and so there's interest in these North American sports even there. And so it's probably 10, 15, 20 years. I don't know. It's well into the future, but I think you'll see a European division and European expansion. I mean, that'll be what's interesting is it probably won't be one team, right? To make it work anyway, logistically, you're going to have to introduce a number of teams at one time. Maybe some of these other leagues will like blend with the NHL. I mean, who knows? I think the sky is the limit in a sense, or like as far as our imagination can take us is what could happen. But I just think with so many players being of European heritage that we're going to see more and more presence in Europe in the future.
A follow-up to your time in London. During your year there, how often did it rain? Because it rains a lot over there. And if you could put it at a percentage.
It was a lot. The worst actually was it was just damp. Like even when it doesn't rain, like you just feel cold. Even when the temperature might say 2 degrees, which, living in Toronto right now, it's minus 11 today Celsius. But it felt colder there. It was like in your bones all the time. I think it's why everyone drinks tea or why that's like, it's just like you feel like you need to constantly be warming your soul somehow. I felt cold there all the time, but what a cool experience that was. It was just after I finished university and actually, worked in journalism there as a news reporter at the Associated Press. And it was a great life experience, probably more than a work experience, just being there. But yeah, it wasn't, I didn't live there for the weather, put it that way.
Two more questions from you, both coming off of Discord. This person has a pretty interesting name, Wham876543. Okay. Any word on whether teams are looking at Joonas Korpisalo as a deadline acquisition in net? What are the odds you think he gets dealt, and who might be in on him?
Well, certainly that's someone Edmonton's looked at. And it's not to say the Oilers have made him their number one target or anything, but they've definitely at least kicked tires there and examined him. He's not having a great season, which makes it difficult, but I do think he could be moved by the deadline. I mean, there's really only a handful of goaltenders that are probably even vaguely in play for the deadline. We don't see a lot of goalies traded in season typically. But I think Korpisalo is at least a possibility for Edmonton. I don't know of anyone else firsthand that's shown interest in him, but it wouldn't surprise me if we saw him moved before the 21st of March.
And from Red Shark Pack, with the Pacific Division being so weak and bunched up, do you see any of the teams other than Seattle being sellers this season? Los Angeles looking okay. San Jose is looking okay. We already discussed what Edmonton's doing. Anaheim too. They're ahead of where they're supposed to be this year.
Yeah, I don't see any sellers there. I mean, I think if Anaheim, say, falls off in the next 6 weeks, then they still have 2 weeks to become sellers. I think that they're a team because of where they're at in their cycle. Like, this is kind of a bonus year, in my opinion. I don't think anyone expected halfway through the season they'd be right in the middle of the playoff mix. And really, for most of the year, have held down, been inside the playoff line. And so if they get to the point where they fall away from that and they're 8 points out or 10 points out come early March, I could see them turning into sellers. But beyond that, I don't see a lot of selling to be done. I mean, the Kings have sold off a lot of what they were going to sell off in recent years. It's not to say they won't make maybe a trade or two out, but they don't have the pieces. But Anaheim's got decisions because they got 3 fairly prominent UFAs, pending UFAs, players that I think could get them a decent size return if they're in the mood to sell them. And so that's probably the only team other than Seattle in the Pacific I think will do it. I mean, Edmonton, I don't care where they sit, they're not selling. I think Calgary will be buying, and then the teams that, at the top. I mean, Vegas is. I don't know if Vegas has any space at all. I'm still unclear how this whole cap maneuvering is going to go with Jack Eichel. They seem very calm about it, so I presume they have a plan. But they maybe they trade out a player and bring in more dead money. Someone who's injured, and then they're able to create cap room that way. I know they're a really smart analytical team in Vegas, but yeah. No sellers other than Anaheim's a question mark, and Seattle will sell, and that's it for the Pacific.
Jack Eichel, that's a name we have not heard from in a while. I assume we'll have an episode either in the coming weeks where we talk about his debut with the Golden Knights, because he's already skating with teammates. So they're trying to I saw Pete DeBoer had a quote in recent days, the coach of the Golden Knights, sort of saying he might be a month or two away. Like you feel like they're trying to maybe tamper down expectations for when he'll play, which is understandable. Look, it was still a serious surgery and he's been on skates for a while, but they have to see how he reacts to contact. I think they want to be careful. But the other thing you can't help but look at, Julian, is if you open up your schedule, I know this is really soon, but there's a game February 1st against Buffalo. I'm not saying that Jack Eichel is going to play in that game, but I'm not saying he's going to play in that game. Like, I know it seems incredibly soon. It might be too soon. Like, ultimately, it might not be possible. But I think Jack Eichel is aware of that game, put it that way. And I think it's something maybe in his own mind he wouldn't mind being there for. It's a little on the close end. He was supposed to be 3 months minimum from a November 12th surgery. So, that takes you to February 12th. It might not ultimately be possible, but you're right. In the coming weeks, for sure, we're going to see him play his first game for Vegas. It's still just a matter of when, everyone's comfortable that it's the right thing to do. Can't wait for that. And that's going to do it for our Monday edition of the CJ Show. CJ, a pleasure as always to do these episodes with you on the Chris Johnston Show, and a pleasure to just be able to do these shows personally. Also, just thank you to everyone who listens and watches these episodes on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts as well. Thank you for your support of the SDPN as a whole. A lot of big things coming. By the time you get this podcast, we might be a few hours away from an announcement, or you may have already heard the announcement.
My understanding is we're going to have new teammates by the end of the day.
I think so. I'm pretty excited about the prospect of having new teammates, and those who are fans of the SDPN, you should be too. Be sure to check out CJ's work in the Toronto Star. Be sure to check out my work in The Athletic as well. That's going to do it until Thursday. But we'll have stick taps. Also, before I go, I should mention this for future stick taps. Got myself some mini sticks. That,
like the goalie one.
Yeah, the goalie one is really nice. So I'll try to plug those a little bit more when we actually do stick taps on Thursday. For CJ, I'm Julian saying so long.
The Chris Johnston Show. Inside the game, twice a week. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris. And follow Julian McKenzie @JK McKenzie.